Hey, everybody. So excited to be here on this Friday, the beginning of February 2025. I'm not really sure where January went, but I have an amazing guest today, my friend, Dr. Gillian Mandich. Did I say that right?
You did, yes. Good job.
Asked before in our brief.
Yeah.
Um, and if you are watching live, or even if you are watching the recording, wherever you are, say hi. Let us know where you are listening or tuning in from. Definitely want to say hello. And if you have any questions along the way, write them in the comments. But today, Gillian is going to talk to us about her story and this topic called happiness. If you can imagine, she is a happiness expert, right? So we're going to figure out with her really all the things that you need to do to be happy, right? We're super simple. She is in Toronto. I'm going to let you talk about your story a little bit. I want to hear what take us back a little bit on the journey you've been on. And what I love so much about Jill is her huge transition in her life, this huge career switch. So I want you to talk about that, and then we'll get into some more happiness.
Sounds great. And before we get into that, I just want to give a quick disclaimer. I have an adorable French bulldog named Jocko, and he is sleeping on the couch. So if at any point during this conversation you hear snoring, don't worry. I'm not putting myself to sleep. I'm not putting Rachel to sleep. It's my bulldog. So
Perfect.
disclaimer.
Disclaimer.
So I'm Gillian. I'm a happiness researcher. And to be honest, I didn't even know that studying happiness was a thing until the second year of my PhD. So my initial plan, I grew up with a mother in academia, and I wanted to become a tenured professor at a university. And so I was studying childhood obesity. So all my degrees, all three of them, are in health science, but my specialization for my master's within health science was child and youth health. And I was studying childhood obesity because I believe, children are our future, and it's really important to establish healthy habits with them. So I went right from my master's into my PhD, still studying childhood obesity. And in the second year of my PhD, I was having an existential crisis at Pilates one day, which is very common in grad school, because I was sort of having a difficulty with it. When you study childhood obesity, a child has to have a BMI, a body mass index, above the 85th percentile for their age and gender in order to qualify for my research. And when I really thought about that, well, one, BMI is calculated with height and weight, right? And two, when you think about that, it's like I'm using the number on a scale to determine if I could help a child. And I didn't love that. And so at Pilates, having this existential crisis, and the woman next to me was a Prophet Ivy we have the top business school in the country at the university I went to, Western, in London, Ontario. And she said, maybe you should switch to the business school. Like, we have a health section and you seem sort of entrepreneurial. And I was like, yeah, you know what? That's probably a good idea. And then she made this off comment. I don't know if you've ever had one of those moments where someone makes a comment, they don't even remember telling you, but it changes your life, right? And she said to me, you actually might like my sister's research. She's in New Brunswick and she studies sustainable happiness. And I was like, what's that? So I went home and looked it up. And sustainable happiness is sort of how our environment affects our happiness. But as I'm sitting at my computer, second year of my PhD, for the first time in my life, the thought entered my head that you can study happiness. And so because I was in health science, I thought, well, I wonder if there's a connection between happiness and health, right? And so I went on PubMed, a search engine for academic research, and I started typing in, happiness and health. And then I started reading all this research about how when you compare happy people to less happy people, they're physically healthier. So they, have lower rates of cardiovascular disease, they have stronger immune systems, they have an increased lifespan, so number of years that you live, as well as health span, so number of healthy years. They make better nutritional choices, they sleep better, and the list goes on and on. And so I thought, in a childhood obesity intervention, the goal is to establish healthy habits for children that they can maintain into adulthood. And here with happiness, one, it's more inclusive, right? It has nothing to do with the number on a scale, but at the end of the day, the outcome is still better, healthy habits. And so I thought, this is way better. And so I switched. It was a bit of a struggle because there wasn't anyone studying happiness at my university. So finding a supervisor was really challenging, but figured it out, and I'm very happy that I did.
Oh, okay. So you're studying. Okay. So first talk about, so you make this switch. What you did, I mean, what was your dissertation like when you graduated? I mean, what was some of the findings that you had?
Yeah. So what I did, and so my PhD actually took me 6 years instead of the typical 4, because I essentially had to restart all of my research. So you can do sort of 2 different formats for it, my university anyway, for your dissertation. You can do 3 sort of studies or 1 really big study. So with childhood obesity, I had already done 1.5 studies. So that kind of just went out the window. I had to restart. And so I did a really big study for happiness. And what was really cool was, what I did was an educational intervention. It was a piloting of a 4-week happiness educational intervention. And so what it was students at Western could learn different skills that are correlated with happiness. And I sent out 1 mass, so you can send out like a mass email to all the undergrads at the university.
Mhm.
I sent out 1 mass email, and I had 1,182 students say that they wanted to participate. And the subject line in the email was just, do you want to learn how to be happier? And there was also no financial incentive. Like often with undergrads, if you give them $5, they'll do a lot to participate in research. And when I had done my sample size calculation, I needed 80, like 80, and I had 1,162 want to participate.
Pretty
So
good.
that was one of the first times that I was like, I really feel like there's this interest in happiness, because we all want to be happy, but we weren't taught how to be happy. So when we can apply scientific principles to learn about happiness, just like we learn about cardiovascular disease or nutrition or diabetes or whatever it is something that can help us to point the needle in a sort of more accurate direction to help us actually live a happier and healthier life.
So what is it? What do we have to do?
So
What were those like findings that you had from over 1,000 students?
So I actually couldn't even have that many students in my study, because whenever I had originally put in, I think, for 100 participants in my ethics board, and then I went and submitted a revision to get more students, but they didn't understand that when things are online, like it doesn't really matter if you have 100 or 1,000, right? Because it's just send out a link.
Right.
So, and then it delayed things a lot. So didn't end up getting them all due to my ethics board, which is a bummer. But what we saw, and I think this is sort of just to zoom out for a second, I'll circle back. When we think about our happiness, there's sort of 3 main players that affect sort of our total capacity for happiness. So one of them is genetic. So you can thank your parents or not, but that does play a role. And like we all kind of know some of those like Eeyore type people, right? But the conversation doesn't end there. And there's 2 other big players. So the second one is environment. I mentioned that sort of sustainable happiness. So that work really looks at like environmental impacts on happiness. And then the third one is our thoughts, our actions, and our habits. And so all of my work has focused on that piece, thoughts, actions, habits, because if you sort of look at what's amenable to change, that to me is the lowest hanging fruit, because we live in our head every day and we control what we do for the most part. And what we know from research is that when we start to build our happiness habit, and I'll talk about that in a second, not only can we increase our happiness short term, like we can have a day where we feel really good, but we can actually sustain our happiness at higher levels. And so what that looks like, and the way I think about happiness, is like a muscle. So if you want to get strong, you go into the gym and you do 1 rep, right? Nothing really changes. But if over time you consistently go into the gym, you consistently do reps, your muscles get stronger. And so the thoughts, actions, habits piece of happiness, what we know is that the frequency of positive emotions is a much better predictor of your happiness than the intensity. So it's really about creating what I call like micro moments of happiness. And so these micro moments are like reps. So 1 walk with a friend, 1 journal entry in a gratitude journal, those don't change your life. But when you start to compound them over time, that's how you sustain it at higher levels. And so the thing about that's really empowering, I think, is so many of us think like, I will be happy when, right? When I
Yes.
have X amount of dollars, when I get married, when I get divorced, whatever it is. But what we've done when we say that is we've put our happiness contingent on something that may or may not happen in the future, right? So that's a problem. And then the other thing is we have this concept in psychology called affective forecasting, like AFF, affective forecasting, forecasting your affect, trying to predict how you're going to feel. And so what we know is, say you get that thing, you get that promotion, you get that car, that house, whatever it is. One, it doesn't bring as much happiness as you anticipated that it would. And
Mhm.
two, it doesn't last for as long as you think that it does. And so instead of thinking about happiness like a destination, when we think about these micro moments of happiness and building that muscle, those reps over time, now it's brought it into today, right? Into the question of like, what's one thing I can do today to make myself happy? And when we start to consistently do that over time, if we look in terms of meaningful change and meaningful impact and how we can actually boost our happiness muscle, that's sort of the way that I think about it, and the way that I think is something that we can do. It's manageable, right?
Very, very manageable. So what do you do? Just curious.
Yeah, and so I'll answer that. But first, the other thing. So when I tell people I study happiness, sometimes people think that I'm happy all the time. And so I just want to make it very clear that I am a happiness researcher. I am not happy all the time, but that's not the point. Can we be happy all the time? Absolutely not. We're humans. We have a full spectrum of emotions. But can we be happier than we are right now? Absolutely. So, in terms of healthy psychological functioning, the goal in life is not to be happy all the time. And when I first started researching happiness, like I remember I was sitting, I had my journal, and I started asking myself, because once you start to think about the fact that you're going to study happiness, it brings up questions, right? Like, Jillian, are you as happy as you possibly could be? And so I thought, no, I'm not. And I thought, I don't like feeling stressed. I don't like feeling anxious. I don't like feeling depressed. So why don't I study happiness, figure out how to get rid of all those emotions and just be happy all the time? So
Yeah.
that was my goal going into my PhD. But then when you dive into the literature, I started reading things. Sometimes it's referred to in like the scientific literature as like the dark side of happiness, where what we see is that people that try to be happy all of the time end up being less happy than other people.
Mm.
And when I first read that, I was like, how does that make sense? Like, if you think about it, if you have like a weight loss goal or something, right?
Yeah.
And even if you don't get to that exact number or that exact size, like at least you're trending in the right direction, right?
Yeah.
But when I thought about it some more, I'm like, well, hold on a second. What happens when we don't reach our goals, right? If someone was to take like a microphone and put it in our head,
Yeah.
hear the way we talk to ourselves, right? It's often very unkind. And so knowing that it is impossible to be happy all of the time, it gives us grace to be a human who has a full spectrum of emotions. And when we are having a bad day, and we all have bad days, myself included, it takes away that feeling of like, I should be feeling happy. Because that's the other thing. Like, I don't know, like, I'm sure this has happened to me, like where you're having a bad day and you try to like pretend to be happy, right?
It's the worst.
It's the worst. It's more exhausting.
Yeah.
In research, we call this emotional suppression. So, suppressing our emotions. And what we see is that when we suppress our emotions, it increases our risk of all cause mortality, death, and cancer risk. So,
Mm.
from a physical perspective, suppressing our emotions is highly problematic. So, it's not just a question of like try to push it away, it doesn't matter. And the other thing is when we push those emotions away or pretend like they're not there, they don't actually go away, right? They get stronger. We call this amplification.
Yeah.
So, a big piece of the happiness conversation is understanding that we can't be happy all the time, but we can be happier. And it's an empowering thing to know that when we focus on what are some micro moments of happiness, and maybe we can explore some of those, but they're small, right? So they don't take up a lot of mental real estate. So we don't think that they're very meaningful, right? We often think it's the big shiny moments that bring us happiness, right? We think it's the trip.
Yeah.
Although we were in Miami last week and that was a pretty fun trip, right?
Yes, it was.
But it's those things, or it's the day that you buy a new house, or the day that you get married, or your 40th birthday, or your 80th birthday, whatever it is. Those things, they don't take up as much time as if you start to add up the micro moments for your sort of everyday life. It actually adds up to a lot more happiness. And so that's the empowering piece, is knowing that we can do something about it. And one of my biggest pet peeves is when you go into, when you go to those home stores and they have like those signs that you put in like your kitchen or your bathroom that say like home is where the heart is or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
My biggest pet peeve is when I see, and my mother has this one in her bathroom at home, at her house. And it says choose happy.
Oh,
Because that's the thing. It's not like we wake up in the morning and we choose our outfit and we choose happy. It doesn't work like that, right? Like people want this magic pill. Sometimes we get lucky and something good happens, but a lot of the time it requires work and effort. So the way I think about happiness is the same way I think about physical activity and nutrition. And what I mean by that is, like, say after our call today, you go and you have the best workout of your life. Okay. Would you text your husband and be like, I just had the best workout of my life. I've reached fitness,
no.
right? And you wouldn't have a green smoothie in the morning and put like all the superfoods in it and be like, that was amazing. I've reached nutritional wellness, right? We understand that lunchtime's going to roll around and we're going to be hungry. We understand that if we want to be fit and healthy, we have to move our body on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And so instead of seeing happiness like a destination, if we see it like a habit, just like we see nutrition and physical activity, and that habit happens by creating those micro moments, putting in those reps every single day, then that's how we actually build our happiness muscle. And that's how I think about it.
I mean, it resonates so much with me. And as I'm thinking, I'm like, to me, nothing is better than going to have a latte, like,
Oh,
or, a cappuccino when it's like in an actual mug
with a pretty design.
with a pretty design, ideally.
Yeah.
And somebody made it for me and I'm sitting, and then also like having a croissant, like, and that's like a little guilty pleasure. It's so small, to your point, but I look forward to those things. And now I'm realizing, oh wait, those are those micro moments, or going to get my nails done.
Yeah.
That's just something I like, or putting on the nice face cream.
Yeah.
Like so we get to really tap into what we're feeling and what feels good. And that I think is challenging for people, Joe,
Oh, for
because
sure.
it's like, well, to your point of, I should feel good about this. And people are kind of dissociated, right, from what is actually making me feel calm. Like, what does feeling happy actually mean to me?
Yeah. And it gets even more complicated because people always ask me, like, what do I do to be happy? Right? Like, what's the magic pill? What's the one thing I have to do or buy or get or say? And so because I'm a happiness researcher, I'm constantly asking people, like, what makes you happy? Right. And I've noticed this pattern that pre-pandemic, when I asked people, common responses that I would frequently hear are things like, oh, the trip I just went on, or the new home reno I did, the car I just bought, whatever.
Yeah.
Post-pandemic, when I ask people, I'm hearing a lot more of things like going for a walk with my friend, having coffee or dinner with my mother, giving someone a hug, right?
Yeah.
And so when I say, like, how do we be happier? Step number one isn't about even adding or doing anything else, right? We're all busy. We have full plates. But step number one is not about seeking, like, SEEK happiness. It's about seeing it, like SEE. Step one is notice what's already good in your life that you appreciate. Because the thing is, we get on autopilot and we go, 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 go. And like you said, there are these things like having a latte with a croissant, which, by the way, next time you're in Toronto, I'm taking you to an amazing place for that.
Can't wait.
But it's starting to appreciate the things that we already have that are good, but we just get used to them and we don't notice them. And it wasn't until you take something like a pandemic that actually removes those things that we realize, like, hold on a second, my soccer rec league that I played on Tuesday actually brought me a lot of joy. Or, my lunch dates that I used to go on with a friend really brought me a lot of joy. So starting to notice those things before we start to add anything else is a great way to start, because once we start to notice and appreciate those things and we give our attention there, that's when we can start to see it really having an impact, as opposed to just sort of being this like robot on autopilot, like onto the next, onto the next, onto the next,
I love that. Yeah, it's just resonating for me because in the last year, we've had a lot of challenges. And every time I got in bed, I decided I'm just going to think about 1 to 3 things that were good today. The smallest thing. I put my hand on my heart and I think it might usually it's Ava's smile and her walking up and being so excited. That's always there. Or going on that walk. And every night I try to think, even on the hardest days, even on those hardest days, I've been doing that. And I think it really does help also set my brain in a good way for sleep.
Yeah, practicing gratitude, right? And that, like, what you're doing, that 3 good things, is a very frequently used gratitude exercise in research. And it's so powerful, right? But it's, again, those micro moments where it doesn't take a lot of time. It doesn't cost anything, right? And yet when you start to do it over time, you see a really big difference. And I think that the other thing is, like, a happy life doesn't mean that, like, hard things don't happen or that difficult things don't happen. And it doesn't mean that we pretend that everything's good all the time, right? We call that toxic positivity. And that's not what we're talking about. A happy life means that when you start to build your happiness muscle, right? So you start to get stronger, your happiness increases, your highs get higher, right? Because your muscle gets stronger, your happiness gets more increased further. But your lows, or those challenging moments, right? Job losses, divorces, pandemics, health issues, whatever it is, those are a part of life. And so it's not about eliminating those things. It's really about understanding that as I grow my happiness muscle, my highs will get higher and my lows, they won't go away, but they'll get higher too, because I am more resilient and better able to cope with hard things. Because if you think about your life, right? Like, some of the challenges and difficulties that you go through, they push you to limits that you didn't even realize you were capable, right? Like, sitting on a beach, sipping margaritas gets boring after a while, right? A happy life is full of adventure and challenges and growth and learning. And so I think that's part of it too, because, some of you watching right now might be going through hard times. And sometimes in those cases, happiness doesn't even make sense, right? Or if you're at a funeral, happiness doesn't make sense, I guess, depending maybe, but for the most part. But it's about, and in those cases, this is where something like hope or resilience comes in. But a happy life means that when we have those moments of happiness, that we're really, like, enjoying and appreciating and savoring them, right? Like when you talked about having a latte with a croissant, so many of us, it's just like chug the coffee, shove some food in our mouth, out the door. The savoring, right? So that's sort of the scientific word for, like, stopping to smell the roses. Is something that is a beautiful way to have a micro moment, whether it's like, even this morning, it's freezing cold in Toronto today. And I was walking Jocko this morning and I just felt like the sun on my face, and it just felt so warm and such. And I just stood there and I soaked it in, right? It didn't take a lot of time. But that's savoring. And it's something that when you start to build that habit, right? It's one of those things that personally, I find quite profound in terms of increasing or growing my happiness muscle.
Oh man, so many good things. I have 2 more questions and then we'll come to a close. And this might actually, I don't want this to get too loaded. Okay, Jill.
Okay.
I know that social media. In your research, have you done some research around social media and the effects on happiness?
Yes. So I actually, I taught in the Faculty of Health Science at Western at my university while I was doing my PhD. And one of the courses that I taught was a 4th-year course called Health and Social Media. And my first lecture, first day, one of the first slides I put up is a picture of Spider-Man with the wisdom of the line from the movie, right? With great power comes great responsibility. That's how I see social media. It is a useful servant, a dangerous master, right? I'm always scared to say this title. So the UN has a university in Costa Rica, and every year they host a happiness conference in March. And so one year I presented on social media and I called my talk, "Hey Siri, make me happier." And when I asked her that,
so good, by the way.
And when I asked, but I'm like, I better ask Siri, like, what does she say, right?
Yeah.
I'm always scared because sometimes when I say that, she pops up on my computer.
Oh yeah, of course, everything.
But she said that is beyond my capability at the moment.
Perfect.
But the thing about social media is, and the way I presented that talk was like, it's not a black and white either or, right? It's a yes and it's a nuanced conversation.
Yeah.
Social media can be a great way to connect. Say you have a hobby where, people around the world you can connect. Like I love puzzling, right? So I'm in a puzzle group where people post puzzles and like good brands of puzzles and what are bad puzzles. And that's amazing. And it's a great way to connect. But when it starts to become something where we're on it all the time, where like I live in a condo in downtown Toronto, and sometimes I'll catch myself waiting for the elevator, and without even paying attention, I've taken my phone from my pocket, I've opened it up, and I've started to scroll.
Yeah.
Like autopilot.
Yeah.
That's a problem. And the other really big key thing, and if I could just sort of give one really important tip about social media, it is do not go on social media first thing in the morning. Do not go on your phone. Or watch news. So there's research from Sean Aker and his wife, Michelle Gillian, and they found that watching just 3 minutes of news that you perceive to be negative in the morning, so whether you consume that via television or via your phone, 3 minutes of news that you perceive to be negative, you have a 27% greater likelihood of reporting your day as unhappy 6 to 8 hours later. So it's not a question of open up your phone, scroll, turn it off. It's not a question of turn on the TV, turn it off. The residue of that stays with you. And if you do that every single day, at least one of those days, it's affecting your happiness and your mood. And so, if we can kind of bookend, and ideally bookending like morning and evening.
Yeah.
That's a simple thing that often is just a habit to break, right? But in terms of our happiness and our mental health, really important.
Okay. Thank you for addressing all those pieces. And I'm sure there's a lot more research to come on that.
Mm-hmm.
And the news piece, I mean, gosh, I can't. Like
I know.
I've already made that decision years ago. Okay, so my last bit is off the topic for a second because I think you've had a really amazing journey, Jill. And a lot of my followers are they might be employed, they might be entrepreneurs or founders, and you were on this linear path,
Mm-hmm.
right? To you, what did you want to do? Were you going
I
to be
wanted to be a prof in health science, like my
okay?
mom.
That's the professor at a great university, and that was your path. And
Yep.
then what happened that you decided to make this huge 180 to now be on TV, speaking all over the world? How the heck did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I wonder too. So for those of you watching, I'm like the happiness expert on like all the shows in Canada, and I travel and do a lot of public speaking about the science of happiness, which I didn't even know was a thing. What happened was when I was studying childhood obesity, as I mentioned, one of the big challenges doing that research is recruitment. And so you need to have participants in order to write your thesis to get data. And so I was trying all these different things to get participants. And so one of the things that I thought might be good is we had like a local TV station in London where I lived. And so I emailed the producer and I thought if I go on their morning show and I talk about my research, I can sort of demystify it. I can explain what the benefits are. I can explain, what to expect. And so because it was targeted just to London, I thought maybe people will see that. And then they might contact me to participate, which did work.
Yeah.
And so after my first show, the producer said to me, Jill, you did a great job. Like, do you want to come back? And at the time I was in my master's and I said, well, I'm a master's student. I only have one study right now, but like, if I have another one, he's like, no, like you can just come and talk about whatever you want. And so I thought, okay. And so I paid for all my grad school myself. So I had to work a lot of jobs. And so one of the jobs that I worked was I used to teach yoga at Adrenaline. It's sort of like a UFC, MMA, jiu-jitsu gym in London. And so I would go on and I would talk about like yoga or meditation or breath work. And then I was teaching at Western at the time. And I realized that TV is teaching. It's just in a different classroom. And so I'm also highly competitive. So after I started doing the London TV for a while, in Canada, the big TV is all in Toronto. So I didn't know how PR worked or media. Like I'm an academic, right? So I just started emailing producers on shows. I would like try to find them on LinkedIn or Google, or sometimes you can like guess, like it'll be like first name dot last name, right? Like you can sort of guess. And so the first show to ever write me back was called The Social. So it's sort of like The View. You guys have The View in the States. In Canada, we have The Social. And so I was like super nervous, but I went and did a segment. And then I pitched another one. And then I thought about it. I'm like, every show has a fashion expert and like a beauty expert, a mortgage expert. I'm like, and I don't like the word expert, but that is what it is.
Sure.
Why isn't there someone that's talking about something from an evidence-based perspective that's universal to every single viewer? Yeah. And so I just sort of pitched it and became the happiness expert on these shows, talking about the science of happiness. And from there, people started seeing me on TV and asking me to come speak in their organizations. And because I was teaching at the time, I'm like, well, if I go speak at an organization or at a conference, it's just like giving a lecture at the university, which I'm already doing.
Yeah.
And there's no marking. So it's kind of better.
Yeah.
And then it just started growing from there. And when I got to the end of my PhD, I was sort of hit this fork in the road of like, do you commit to the tenured thing and you're going to have to take a step back from all this other stuff because there's not time for both? Or are you going to lean into that? And I sat with it for a really long time. And I thought, you know what do I care about most? I care about education, teaching, research, and impact. And when I was teaching at Western, I taught the largest course in my faculty. It was a first-year health science course with 500 students. When I go do a talk, sometimes I'm talking to thousands of people. And so when I think about reach and impact, I was like, that's what I'm going to lean into. So wow. It's a wild ride. I have no idea where it's going, but what I do know is that I'm happy along the way, because that's the thing. Happiness is not a destination, right? It's also, I put up this slide a lot when I do talks. It's from a children's book called Big Panda, Tiny Dragon. Mm-hmm. And so there's a picture in it I put in my slides, and it's got a big panda with a tiny dragon sitting on top. And then the caption is, which is more important, asked Big Panda, the journey or the destination? Mm. And it says, the company, said Tiny Dragon. Mm. And I think that's it. I love the people I'm around, you, our friends, our group. And even though I don't know what the destination is, I have great company and I'm enjoying the journey. So, and that's kind of the point, right?
Yeah, exactly. You're leading by example, which I think is true authenticity. And when we talk about building a personal brand and how do we figure out what that purpose is and align it to our subject matter expertise and the audience we want to serve and find that unique differentiation, those components are what make Dr. Gillian. That is what makes Rachel B. Lee. Yeah. And I think it's just such a wonderful example for anybody that watches and listens today, because our paths don't have to be linear, right? Yeah. But you kind of felt in to what you wanted to create and who you could serve and how you could impact, and connected that with your experience and your lived life, And so I just love that story. I think it's such a great way to think about personal branding and wrap up this amazing interview. If people want to stay up to speed with your research, they want to hear you speak, anything, of course, connect with her on LinkedIn. How else can they get connected?
I'm trying to get better at LinkedIn, so this is a good thing for me. My website is gillianmandich.com, and my Instagram is gillianmandich.com. And those are both great places. One last thought. I wanted to just end on this. I love everything you just said. And I think that sometimes when we try to figure out what do we want to do, what makes me happy, it's overwhelming, right? And so in those cases, it's just like, what's the next step, right? Mm-hmm. Like, what's the one thing I can do this week or whatever? And you take that step. And that's what I've always done. And that's what I continue to do, because who knows what's going to happen, but if we really sit with it and we start to ask ourselves, what makes me happy? What do I enjoy? Who do I want to serve? All of those questions, the next step, that's all I focus on. And then you look back and you're like, oh my goodness, I'm a happiness researcher who travels the world talking about the science of happiness. Like, how did I get from wanting to be tenured to that? Right. It's next step.
Yeah.
So I love the work that you're doing. I appreciate you so much and for having this conversation with me. I think that it's an important conversation to have, and you're just amazing and such a joy. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Everyone, thank you so much for chatting with us today. We cannot wait to see all the comments and reply back. And I hope you have a great rest of your February. And with that, we'll see you next month.